So hello there, and welcome back to another Night of the Movies video. I am of course Spike Knight, and in these videos I love talking about things, movies and TV, and whatever I want, wherever I want. And in today's video I am once again talking about one of my favourite subjects, which is the Beatles, and the fact that the Beatles Anthology is now all on Disney Plus, and there's a new episode as well on there. There's a new episode that is part of the Beatles Anthology, should I say, on Disney Plus with the rest of the Beatles Anthology, which is finally on there. So let's get into that, shall we? The Beatles Anthology is finally on Disney Plus. And I wasn't planning on doing a video about that because a year and a good few months ago now, I did a video on the Beatles Anthology. I did a video talking about why it deserved more attention, and I also brought up the fact that it wasn't on Disney Plus in that video, and I said that it should have been on Disney Plus, and I also said that I reckon one day it will be, but it wasn't at that point. And I made that video, I want to say in late August I think, of 2024, and now we are here in December of 2025, and the Beatles Anthology, the entire Beatles Anthology plus an extra new episode, is all on Disney Plus. And actually, it went all on Disney Plus. It all arrived on Disney Plus last week, so it actually came onto Disney Plus in November of 2025. But I'm recording this video now in December 2025. So for the sake of this video today, as of December 2025, the entire Beatles Anthology is now on Disney Plus. And like I said, I wasn't planning on making a video about this because I already did that about a year ago. I already made an almost hour video, I think. Yeah, it was almost an hour long about the Beatles Anthology and my love of it about a year ago or so on this channel. I think, yeah, August 2024. But then I heard that there was going to be an extra episode which featured never before seen footage of the Beatles, and it was going to include more information about the making of the Beatles Anthology docuseries. And when I heard that, I was like, okay, that's interesting. I'll probably watch the extra Beatles Anthology episode then on Disney Plus, but I don't know if I'll make a video about it. But then I watched the episode last night and I was like, actually, you know what? I'm going to make a video on it. So, here I am, a week after the Beatles Anthology started to release on Disney Plus. Here I am discussing the fact that the Beatles Anthology is now on Disney Plus with an extra episode. So, if you don't know already, and by the way, I'm going to give my thoughts and feelings on the extra episode a bit later in this video, but if you do not know already, the Beatles Anthology is a docuseries which tells the complete, detailed, comprehensive story of the Beatles in their own words. There's no other people telling their story in this docuseries, it's all them. The docuseries was made, I want to say, in the 90s. Yes, I'm pretty sure it was made in 1995. I think that's when it came out. And in the docuseries, you have interviews from Paul McCartney discussing his time in the Beatles, you have interviews from Ringo Starr discussing his time in the Beatles, and you have interviews from the late great George Harrison discussing his time in the Beatles, because this docuseries was made before George Harrison died. Now, you do not have interviews from John Lennon discussing his time in the Beatles, because obviously John Lennon had died before this docuseries was made, but you do still have a lot of footage of John Lennon in this docuseries, and you also see a lot of interviews from him that almost feel like they were made for the docuseries even though they weren't. So that's kind of interesting in itself. So you do have interviews from all the members of the Beatles, even so not all of them were around when the docuseries was in production, when it was being made. And hearing the story of the Beatles from their perspective is what really makes this docuseries special. And not only does this docuseries have interviews from the band members themselves, the people who were there throughout the entire process, it's also got interviews from the late great George Martin, who is sadly no longer with us, but again, he was around when the docuseries was made. And if you don't know who George Martin is, he was a long time producer of all the Beatles music. Now, I don't know Actually, I don't know if he produced all of the Beatles music. I think he produced most of them. My dad used to tell me that he didn't produce the song Let It Be. I don't know if that's true, or he didn't produce the album Let It Be, but I'm pretty sure he did produce some of the songs in the album because he's featured in the Get Back docuseries, which came out on Disney Plus, I want to say in 2021. Wow, it came out 4 years ago now. That's crazy. I still think that docuseries came out yesterday. It still feels like yesterday that the Get Back docuseries came out on Disney Plus. But anyway, George Martin, I'm pretty sure, he produced almost all of the Beatles music, if not all of the Beatles music. I might be incorrect when saying he didn't produce the song Let It Be, but he was definitely there for almost all of the recording of the Beatles music, and he features in a lot of interviews throughout this docuseries, which add to the overall story of the Beatles, because again, he was there throughout so much of the process. He was there in all the recording sessions. He was there when they recorded their first album, Please Please Me. He was there when they were recording Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which is arguably one of the most important, if not the most important album of all time. Some may argue Revolver now, but personally, I'm still a Sgt. Pepper person, although I do love Revolver. But anyway, he was also there when they recorded the White Album. He was there when they recorded Abbey Road, and he was there when they recorded Let It Be. So, Let It Be the album, should I say. Again, I'm not sure if he was there when they recorded Let It Be the song, but you get the point I'm making. George Martin was there throughout all of the recording process, and you have interviews from all these different people who are close to the Beatles as well. These people are so integral to their story, including Neil Aspinall, who was the person who made this docuseries happen. He features in a lot of interviews, and that really makes the docuseries feel more detailed and comprehensive, and it makes it all feel more complete at the same time, because you are hearing the Beatles story through their story, through their own words, which does make a difference. There have been so many Beatles documentaries and so many Beatles docuseries out there where it's telling the story, but it's not got interviews from them, and it's not got the music of them, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't feel like it's actually their story. But then when you look at the Beatles Anthology, it's like, oh yeah, that is their story. And this docuseries has so much great footage in there as well. So much great archival footage of the Beatles playing at all these venues when they were like world famous in their early days, and girls were screaming at them to the point that you couldn't even hear their music being played. You couldn't even hear them playing their music because of all the girls screaming. And it's got all this great footage of them in the recording studio doing these albums, and them doing interviews together when they were touring, and then them doing interviews when they were not touring anymore, and then there was all this sort of speculation about what they were going to do next. You see some interviews from the time leading up to the release of the seminal album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. There's so much footage in this docuseries, that I do think is so fascinating to watch, and it's all throughout. It's not just all the early footage. There's loads of footage from the later years of the Beatles, when they stopped touring and when they were just in the recording studio. And seeing all of this rare footage in the Beatles Anthology series, again, going back to the word, it's just fascinating. And on top of that, the Beatles Anthology docuseries also has interviews from the remaining 3 band members at the time when together, reunited. You see Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr and George Harrison in their older years reunited, talking about their time being in the Fab Four. Again, it's just, when you're watching interviews when those 3 are together, and there's actually a couple of interviews when they're together with George Martin and listening to old Beatles tracks, when you see that in the docuseries, it's mesmerising. And I've spoken about that at length in my last video on the Beatles Anthology on this channel, but as you can probably tell, I'm a big Beatles fan. So this docuseries is kind of like cake for me. It's like heaven for me. I'm gonna eat it all up. I'm just gonna absolutely love it, because I'm such a huge Beatles fan. I've been a huge Beatles fan for as long as I remember. It annoys me when people say that the Beatles are overrated. If they're not your kind of music, That's fine. Music is subjective. But when people say the Beatles are overrated, I want to slap them over the face with a wet fish, because it's just not true. And I think when you watch this docuseries, you understand that even more so. And yeah, I'm a huge Beatles fan. I'm a Beatles bore. The amount of time I will go on about the Beatles to my family and my friends is kind of ridiculous. So of course I'm going to love this docuseries. But I also think that people who are not as big Beatles fans as I am will love it as well. Because, again, it's the Beatles telling their own story, which does make a difference. I would probably like it if the Rolling Stones did an anthology series like this. And I'm not really a Stones person. I mean, as you can probably tell, I think the Beatles are better than the Stones. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Stones' first big hit was a Beatles cover. Just saying. Anyway, I'd probably love it if the Stones did something like this. I mean, the chances are they probably already have, because they always copied the Beatles. But you get the point I'm making. If it was any band telling their own story, I would probably love that as well, because it makes a difference when it's a band telling their story. You get the point I'm making. I keep repeating that sentiment, but it is the truth when it comes to this docuseries. It's why it works. And I do think that even if you have the slightest bit of interest in the Beatles, you should watch this anthology series. You should watch the Beatles Anthology docuseries, because you will have a newfound respect for them afterwards. I mean, I had a newfound respect for them afterwards when I watched this docuseries for the first time. I watched this docuseries for the first time all the way back when I was like 7 or 8 years old, which I know people may go, "What, really? You watched it that long ago when you were that young?" Yep. I watched it that long ago, and I think that this was actually one of the reasons, this docuseries was one of the reasons that I initially fell in love with the Beatles. Now, initially when I watched it on DVD. That's how I've had it for the longest time. But now it's also available on Disney Plus. And again, I wasn't thinking about making a video about the fact that the Beatles Anthology is now on Disney Plus, but then I heard that an extra episode was going to be included with the Beatles Anthology docuseries being on Disney Plus. I heard that a 9th episode was going to be included, and I was like, okay, you got my interest. What's going to be in this 9th episode, you know? And then I heard that there was going to be all this never-before-seen footage of the Beatles in this 9th episode that was going to be included on the Disney Plus edition of the Beatles Anthology. And so, yesterday, I finally found some time, because I know this 9th extra episode of the Beatles Anthology has been out there for a good couple of days now, but yesterday, I finally found the time to watch the new episode of the Beatles Anthology on Disney Plus, and I loved it. Surprise, surprise, I absolutely loved it, because it was kind of the finale to the docuseries that I never knew I needed. You know what I mean? Like, before I saw this last episode, I always thought the quote-unquote last episode of the Beatles Anthology, the 8th episode, where they talk about the making of Let It Be, where they talk about the making of the White Album, Let It Be, and Abbey Road, I always thought that it had a good ending with that episode anyway. But now, you've got an even better ending, in my opinion. It feels like that last piece of the puzzle that you couldn't find for the longest time, and then you finally got it, and you can finally complete your jigsaw puzzle. You know what I mean? And what I love so much about the last episode is how they talk about the making of the anthology docuseries and how it led to the remaining 3 band members of the Beatles at the time reuniting to make 2 new pieces of music. You know, to make the songs Free as a Bird and Real Love, which are massively underrated songs, in my opinion. I don't think those songs get enough love. I think Now and Then, the Beatles' final song, which they released, was it last year? I think it was last year, if I'm not mistaken. I think was it in 2023? I can't remember when Now and Then came out, the Beatles' final song. But I do think that song is better than Free as a Bird and Real Love. However, I also think Free as a Bird and Real Love are also very good songs. And learn about what went into making those songs in the final episode of this docuseries, which is, in the final new episode of the Beatles Anthology, is... it's fascinating in my opinion. I'm going to keep using that word fascinating in this video today because that's the word which keeps coming to mind. That's the word which kept coming to mind when I was watching the Beatles Anthology, and when I was watching in particular the new last episode of the Beatles Anthology on Disney Plus. Fascinating. That was the word which kept coming to my mind, and hearing how John Lennon had this leftover song they hadn't finished called Free as a Bird, and George Harrison was talking to Yoko at one point, and she was saying, oh, this is leftover song, you want to try this thing that you were trying to do in the Travelling Wilburys with the Beatles, and make a Beatles song out of one of John Lennon's last unfinished songs. And that's what they did with Free as a Bird, and that's what they did with Real Love. I just think it's quite extraordinary, hearing the work that went into that, hearing that they had to get Jeff Lynne from ELO, aka Electric Light Orchestra, to come in and help them, craft that song and record that song, and record both songs, should I say. Again, it's just, I'm watching this and I'm completely absorbed by it. I'm fascinated by it. But I'm also not only fascinated by the making of the songs Free as a Bird and Real Love, in which, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr and George Harrison reunited because of the Beatles Anthology docuseries, but I'm also fascinated by what the last episode discusses in the making of the Beatles Anthology series. In the last episode, you hear them talk about how long it took to make the Beatles Anthology docuseries. How many times are we going to say the words Beatles Anthology docuseries in this video today? I mean, man alive, take a shot every time I do so. But no, you get the point I'm making. In the last episode, you hear them talk about how long it took to make the docuseries, how it was in the works for all this time, and how Neil Aspinall was like the driving force behind the docuseries. And then the docuseries itself took like 4 years to make, which is insane when you think about it. It took that long. 4 years is a good chunk of time, It took 4 years to make, and then the docuseries itself led to Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr and George Harrison reuniting in a way that they hadn't done for quite a bit of time because of the fallout from the Beatles breakup. And then in the last episode, you see more footage of Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr and George Harrison together being interviewed about the Beatles Anthology docuseries, about the making of the docuseries, and then you also see them playing music together again, something which, it's just so... It's just such a joy to watch, because these guys, these were revolutionaries in music. I know people say Ringo Starr wasn't, but he was at the same time. There's not many people who could have been the drummer to Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr and George Harrison and managed to do it well. Paul McCartney and John Lennon, George Harrison, they all spoke about this. John Lennon and George Harrison when they were alive. Paul McCartney still talks about it now. Ringo Starr managed to keep in time with the rest of the band. There was no part where Paul McCartney still speaks about it now, where it's like he never says, he says that at the time he never had to say to Ringo, oh yeah, do something slightly different here. He never had to say that. Ringo Starr just knew every single time when he's playing a Beatles song what to do. So I do think Ringo Starr deserves all the credit as well. Maybe not as much credit as Paul McCartney and John Lennon, who wrote so much amazing music, or even George Harrison for that matter, but he still deserves a hell of a lot of credit, Ringo Starr does. But yeah, seeing these three together just making music again because of the making of the Beatles Anthology docuseries in the last episode. I don't know how much I'm making sense, by the way, but seeing them three together in the last episode in never before seen footage, it's just wonderful. I mean, it's wonderful for someone like me, of course, because I'm a big Beatles fan. I got a Beatles Christmas jumper on for this video today, because December and I'm talking about the Beatles. But it's also just wonderful because, for the longest time, they had this fallout, and everyone was kind of on thin ice with one another after the Beatles broke up. But seeing them together again, making music, it just, even if you're just somebody who likes the Beatles music, you can't help but just seeing them three together, you can't help but have a smile on your face seeing that footage. And there's also some new footage in the last new episode of the Beatles Anthology series on Disney Plus. There's some new footage in the last episode of the remaining three Beatles members at the time, and George Martin, who again was around at the time, listening to some old Beatles recordings of Tomorrow Never Dies, the songs Tomorrow Never Dies and Carry That Weight. And when you watch them listening to this music, again, there's just something about it where it's like, you feel like you're witnessing history. You feel like you're witnessing sort of the people who made history looking back on the history they made, you know? And again, I just find it all so fascinating, and I love that. I love all the extra bits of information and all the extra footage we see in this new last episode of the Beatles Anthology, which is now on Disney Plus. Plus, I love watching the rest of the Beatles Anthology on Disney Plus now. I love watching all these episodes I've seen countless times before, and I mean countless times before, on Disney Plus, because they're all, you know, it's all been restored in 4K, and it's pristine. It's so beautiful to look at. For the longest time, I was watching the Beatles Anthology on DVD, and I was so thankful that I was, because, again, this was, you know, I'd seen this countless times when I was in a much younger age, but the footage a lot of the time was, and it's just falling down there, the footage a lot of the time was grainy, and it didn't always look as good as it could have been. You know, I always thought to myself, oh, if only I bought a Blu-ray of the Beatles Anthology, you know what I mean? But now I don't need to, because it's on Disney Plus, and I'm subscribed to Disney Plus. Now, I will say, you know, in the future, if I ever unsubscribe to Disney Plus for any reason, if I just don't have enough money to subscribe to Disney Plus anymore, then I'm going to be a little bit annoyed, because if I watch the Beatles Anthology again, first of all, it wouldn't look as clean and as pristine as it does on Disney Plus. But also, if I ever watch the Beatles Anthology on DVD again, then it's not going to have, you know, this box set, if we can get it here from where it's fallen down, yes, this box set is not going to have the new extra episode on here. It's not going to have the new episode on here, which is on Disney Plus, which is, yeah, a little frustrating. Hopefully they release that last episode in a new package. Maybe they already have. Hopefully they release it as a new package, as like a new box set, you know, a new Beatles Anthology DVD box set. That's also available on Blu-ray or on 4K or whatever. And you know, if they do that, I just said do that. If they do that, then I will definitely be buying the box set on DVD, because I want to get that last episode, you know, physically. I want to have it in my hands. I don't want it to only be available on streaming, because also sometimes when something is only available on streaming, particularly in the case of Disney Plus, they're not afraid to just take it off Disney Plus. They're not afraid to just take it off streaming if it's not doing numbers anymore, if people aren't watching the stuff anymore. And I don't want that to be the case with the Beatles Anthology docuseries. I feel so relieved, you know what I mean, that this docuseries is now on Disney Plus, because now people can appreciate the docuseries, can appreciate the Beatles story in a way that they just couldn't before, in a way that wasn't, you know, readily available to them before. And now people can just go onto Disney Plus, and the Beatles story is there in comprehensive detail from their own words. And yes, it's a docuseries which is long, with the new episode that was just added to Disney Plus literally a couple of days ago, the new episode that had never came out before, with all this rare, never before seen footage, with the new final episode of the Beatles Anthology, that makes the Beatles Anthology docuseries about 9 hours long, which, you know, is a long docuseries, but it's worth it. Even if you're just somebody who has a little bit of interest in the Beatles, it's so worth it, because it tells a story in such great detail. Like, it doesn't leave anything out, but in a way that makes for such a satisfying and such an engrossing watch. The Beatles story is something that is just amazing to experience, and I think you get that experience from the Beatles Anthology in the best way. I mean, there are parts of the docuseries where the storylines, the stories that, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr are telling about being in the Beatles, there are parts of the docuseries where their stories aren't really aligning. Like, this is a whole bit where each one of the band members, each one of the surviving band members at the time are asked, okay, did John Lennon write the song All You Need Is Love for for it to be broadcast around the world to all these countries? Because that's what happened with the song All You Need Is Love. If you look at the music video, that's what they were doing at the time. They were broadcasting it, the BBC I think were broadcasting it around the world to all these different countries. And Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr in this docuseries were asked, did John Lennon write it specifically for that to be the case? And Paul McCartney saying, no, I don't think he did. Then George Harrison saying, oh, no, I don't think he did. And then Ringo Starr says, no, yeah, I'm pretty sure he wrote it specifically for that. And, so these stories don't always add up, that the interviews are that the interviews from the surviving band members are telling, if you follow me. Yeah, the stories don't always add up in the interviews, is basically what I'm saying. The stories that you get from everybody being interviewed for this docuseries don't always add up. But that also kind of adds to the sort of engagement of the documentary, you know what I mean? Or to the docuseries. That also adds to the enjoyment, because then you have to then you get to see it from all the different perspectives. Again, not all the storylines add up. Not all the stories from the interviews that you see from Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and the late great George Harrison, the late great George Martin, and all the other people interviewed in this docuseries add up. But that just makes it all the more enjoyable to watch, and it makes it feel all the more authentic as well. If it all lined up, then you'd be sat there thinking, okay, there's something not right about this. It's almost like they've spoken to each other before the docuseries came out and agreed what the story was going to be. But because the stories don't all line up, then you don't get that. Point I'm making is, I love how the Beatles Anthology docuseries includes so much information and goes into so much detail, and so much comprehensive detail, and tells the Beatles story in their own words, which makes such a difference. And also, there are so many great stories in this Beatles Anthology docuseries that if you just haven't watched yet, you'll absolutely love. Like the story of how the Beatles met Ringo, how Ringo became the drummer of the Beatles, and the reaction to that happening. Then the story of how the Beatles met Elvis, and how that went down, which is actually more interesting than you think it's going to be. And the story about why the Beatles stopped touring and everything that led up to that. And then the stories that they tell about the building up to the release of the seminal album, my personal favourite album of all time, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and how the build up to that, you had all these news tabloids going, oh, the Beatles are dead, they're not going to make any good music anymore, and saying stuff like that. Probably not saying those words specifically, but you get the point I'm making. And then they come out with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and just go, oh yeah, we're not dead. I mean, just look at it. We just created one of the best albums of all time. And then the stories are centered around the making of the Magical Mystery Tour film, which is a baffling film. I mean, it's quite something. I've only seen it a couple of times, but yeah, haven't watched it for quite a bit actually. Maybe I'll review that in the new year, hey? But then you also get stories about the making of the White Album and how everyone was starting to get on each other's nerves during the recording sessions, and then the recording sessions of Let It Be. You hear stories about that, and then the recording sessions on the album Abbey Road, and how everyone in the band wanted to go out with a bang. You get the point I'm making. There are so many interesting stories in this docuseries, a lot that I haven't even touched on there. There's all these fascinating stories in this docuseries that you just have to learn at some point. They just have to hear at some point in your life, particularly if you even just have the smallest, the littlest of interest in this band, in the Beatles. Watch the docuseries, because you'll just I don't see how you can't get caught up in it. And the last episode, the new last episode of the Beatles Anthology docuseries, is like the cherry on the icing on top of the cake. It's like the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle that I never knew I needed. The final piece of the jigsaw puzzle that I couldn't find for the longest time, and now I finally got it. I can complete the jigsaw puzzle and look back at it with this smile. And that's the thing. I'm going to, now that the Beatles Anthology is on Disney Plus, guess what I'm going to do, loads? Rewatch it on Disney Plus, because it's, again, readily available to me, and that's what I love about it. It's readily available now. People can appreciate this docuseries in a new light like they couldn't before, and again, appreciate the Beatles story from their own words. You know, the docuseries was made in the 90s, which meant that George Harrison had concluded that, which meant that the late great George Harrison at that was included on the interviews for this docuseries, which does make a difference. You know, it makes a huge difference hearing the story from their own words, hearing the story of the Beatles from Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, George Harrison, and the people closest to them, such as George Martin, Neil Armstrong, and so on and so on and so on. I love the Beatles Anthology, love it to pieces, and I'm so glad that it's now on Disney Plus. And I would highly recommend you watching it, even if you just have the smallest interest in the Beatles. Check out this docuseries. You will not be disappointed. And watching on Disney Plus, you get it in a much clearer and pristine, beautiful looking light. You know, it just, yeah, it's great that it's now on Disney Plus, in my opinion. And it's even better that Disney Plus put out an extra 9th episode of the series, which adds a finale to the docuseries that I never knew I needed. Yeah, I absolutely love the Beatles Anthology docuseries, and that's why I'd once again give it a 10 out of 10. I'm pretty sure that's what I gave it about a year and a bit ago now, and I'd easily give it that again. Nothing I'd change about it. Absolutely love it to pieces, and I'm so glad that it's now on Disney Plus, and it's got an extra final episode, a new final episode to complete its story in a way that I never knew, as a huge Beatles fan, that I needed. So all in all, as I've already said, as I'm going to say once more in this video today, I love the Beatles Anthology, and that is why I am, a year and a bit later, still going to give it a 10 out of 10 from me. Anyway guys, that's it for today's video. If you have seen the Beatles Anthology, and my computer's just going off now. Yes, if you've seen the Beatles Anthology, please let me know your thoughts on it in the comment section below. And let me know your thoughts on it being on Disney Plus as well now. Yes, whatever your thoughts are, let me know in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching or listening to this video, and look forward to many more videos coming very, very soon on this channel. As I've already said, thank you all for watching this video. I will see you guys again soon, but bye for now. Bye.